Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Morpho Institute. My name is Krista Dillabaugh, and I'm the Executive Director, and I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to our 2020 Amazon Conservation Through Education webinar series. Tonight, we're particularly interested in the topic of why care about the Amazon in the middle of a global pandemic, and are super pleased to welcome Dr. Dave Pearson from Arizona State University. Dave joined our faculty for the Educator Academy in the Amazon, our K-12 professional development program for teachers, way back in 2015, and he's been with us down there almost every year, working with us on the interaction and interface between ecology, conservation, and ecotourism, and how we can use education to promote sustainable use of biodiversity. Dave has a long history working in the Peruvian Amazon and is ideally suited to take on this topic with us tonight. So Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll catch up with everybody at the end.
Well, welcome everybody, and we can get started here. So, why care about the Amazon when we are in the middle of a pandemic? That's the subject right here. And what I'd like to try and infuse into this is that this is not just a one-way. What we got here? And see what's going on here, that the Amazon is being affected by the pandemic, but also the pandemic is affecting the Amazon. It's going both ways. Okay. So we can begin by looking at history. You know the old saying that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it? Well, we can try and figure out what's happened in the past to start to get an insight into what are pandemics, what's been their influence, and what can we learn from them. One thing is that there have been about more than 20 major pandemics since the Antonine plague in Rome, and it lasted 15 years in Rome, had a major impact on Rome as well. And there and every plague since, we found that the poverty and the suffering was not spread out evenly amongst the population. Those who were poor and those who were forced to live in tight quarters, as is happening right now, were the ones that suffered the most. It also helped bring down entire civilizations. The Spanish really didn't conquer the Aztecs. It was the diseases that the Spanish brought with them, and for which the Aztecs didn't have any immunity. The Athens weren't really conquered by the Spartans, but because they were all crammed together in that city, they were more susceptible to, in this case, apparently smallpox, and the Spartans were able to win not only because of their warrior abilities, but because the Athenians were dying left and right from the diseases. Rome, same thing happened. Interestingly enough, Napoleon had actually started to do more conquering in the Western Hemisphere. He was working through the Caribbean and Haiti. He also owned a big part of the central part of North America, which is now the United States. And what happened was he had his entire army in the Caribbean ready to come in, and they were hit by yellow fever and wiped out almost half the army. That's why in 1803, Napoleon was more than happy to sell the Louisiana Purchase to Thomas Jefferson. And it may well be that because of yellow fever and a pandemic, all that central part of the United States now is part of the United States, not some part of France. So these pandemics have had major influences on what's going on. Also, we find in the past that they've transformed society. They've changed economics. They developed xenophobia. They've helped define who you want to be in, who you don't want to be in. Think about what's going on right now too, and I'll be asking questions later on. But how do you think this pandemic is affecting us from the Amazon and other things? For instance, I've seen right now that many people are now working from home and not going to their office. And it may well be that when this is finally over, they're not going to go back because it's cheaper to stay at home. It can get done just as easily. And that may change a lot of realty approaches of the economic. So we're seeing things that are possible that are going to be changing by this pandemic. And the two most important factors in how severe a pandemic is the density of the population and how well they're connected, how much movement there is between populations. And that makes common sense as to how this is happening and why things are spread so much and so readily. So those are some things we can go onto history. One of the biggest pandemics ever was the Black Plague in Europe, in which about in 1350, and we estimate between 75 and 200 million people died. 200 million people died. It was like a third of the population. And one of the unintended consequences of that we had no idea and no one could have predicted, was it killed off a lot of the working class who were suffering a serfdom. Well, all of a sudden, the working class became valuable and they began to earn more. And it may well have put an end to serfdom. That plague may have ended serfdom as far as the way we identify it now. So again, lots and lots of things are going on with this pandemic that might not always be obvious. So we just talked about density of population. What does this population trend predict for the future? Is this population trend the cause of every one of our conservation environmental problems in the world, from climate change to biodiversity protection? I like to shock my students. They already see me as a geezer, but when I was 6 years old, I met the last surviving Union soldier of the Civil War. And he talked to me about when he was my age, 6 years old, his great uncle talked to him about serving in the Revolutionary War. That close. Think how much has happened in that time. There were fewer than 1 billion people in the world then. Now we're pushing 8 billion, and our kids and grandkids may well see 10 to 12 billion. That is a major problem, and pandemics is just one of the major factors involved in density that may well see these things reoccurring more and more often as it goes on to the future. Another interesting question is, can a pandemic have positive impacts on the environment? And I'm sure most of you have seen the situation going on where all of a sudden a place that was full of pollution in a very short time has become clear, like New Delhi. I have friends at the base of the Himalayas in India who have not seen the Himalayas in 35 years, not seen them because of pollution. And all of a sudden, this is the first time they've been able to see the mountains. Now, is that just a short-term effect? Is this going to pop right back as soon as people start traveling again, the pandemic's over? Or, and think about this, does this have a lifelong effect on people's psychology, on sociology, and economics? Can it have that effect? I know my parents lived through the Great Depression, and it affected them for the rest of their lives. They saved newspapers, they never threw anything away, they were super, super cautious about making sure they didn't overspend. That several years of the Great Depression affected them for the rest of their lives. Is that something that's going to happen now? And might that be something in the Amazon that's also going to have an effect? So what impacts on the Amazon? Can we expect also there to be positive impacts of the coronavirus pandemic on the Amazon? Will it slow loss of natural habitats? What's going to be the effect there? And is there anything positive about that we can see in the Amazon? Let's look at that and understand that and see what we can come up with, try and predict and anticipate what's going on and see what's happening right now. Let's take a few steps back here. My students always get aghast at this picture of all the germs on the hands. It's pretty effective. But look at these infectious agents and understanding a little bit about how predominant they are, how they are everywhere. And there are different types. There are bacteria, and there's the Black Plague. That's probably been the biggest plague of any time in the history of the world, in the history of human beings, killing 200 million people. Lots of viruses, as you can see there, the whole list of viruses. Fungi, we can add things like valley fever here in Arizona. Malaria amongst protozoans is a really major one. These are all types of infectious agents that are involved and could be responsible for the next pandemic and combinations of them. How are they spread? What's going on? Well, here we introduce, that's not zoonoses, zoonosius. Zoonosius is the way we pronounce that usually. And how prevalent are they and how important are they? Well, bacteria and virus and invertebrates and other things, a big part of the diseases in human beings come from association with other animals and have organisms that are adapted to these other organisms evolve to be able to fit into our genome and affect us as well. And they comprise right now about 60% of all infections, diseases in humans come from other animals, and about 75% of all emerging infectious diseases. That's not minor. So let's look at more details of the zoonoses. So as I said, 75% of all emerging infectious diseases in humans are zoonotic. 335 identified diseases have emerged since 1960 that were transferred to humans from other animals, and probably more that we haven't been able to identify. And these include things like West Nile virus, Nipah virus, Zika, Ebola, MERS, swine flu, bird flu, SARS, and now COVID-19. Just to give you, again, a frame of reference of how important these are, zoonotic diseases are responsible for 2.5 billion cases of human infections and 2.7 million human deaths every year across the globe. That's pretty significant. So what do we know about these? Again, here we're beginning to understand, we need to understand some biology, but very quickly we are also understanding these zoonoses bring into necessity the understanding of sociology, psychology, health, economics, business. All these things are affected, as we're seeing already with our COVID pandemic. And if we look at what factors increase zoonotic transfer to humans, I want you to sit and think now. Just think, what would increase this transfer? It's already big time, but what would enhance and increase this transfer of these bacteria and viruses and plasmodium and fungi to human beings? Think about it and go ahead, when you come up with an idea, go ahead and unmute, give us your idea, then mute back up, okay?
You can also add your ideas to the chat if you would like.
This is Mike Hill. I'll throw out habitat destruction, moving closer and closer to wild animals.
Okay, good. That's a good one. Okay, how about another one?
Bushmeat trade.
Okay, there's another one. All right. Especially if it's unsanitary, really unsanitary.
Wild animals as pets.
Ah, as you can see right here, see the sloth being petted in the Iquitos market? All right, good. Oh, another one. Okay, well, let me. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
This is Seth Buddy. I was going to say too, hand in hand with what Mike was saying. I think that when you get into monocultures of agriculture and monocultures of animals, when you lose diversity, my understanding is also that increases the possibility, the chances of transfer.
Let's look at that. Let's look at diversity. That's a really good point. Let's look and see how that, because that's kind of a double-edged sword too. But here are some major ones. You've already covered some of them. So increased human activity in areas of greater biodiversity creates more opportunities for contact with potential host species. In this case, actually being areas of greater biodiversity, why would that be a situation that might enhance zoonotic transfer? We'll get to that in just a second. Hunting or trade in wildlife, especially when they are kept in unhygienic conditions. Some species get a competitive advantage in human-dominated landscapes, increases in numbers, and thus harbor a higher number of potentially zoonotic viruses because they're adapted to being around human beings. Can anybody think of an example? What's an animal that has become very adapted to human urbanization and probably is very much involved with spreading more diseases? Think of any example?
Rats.
Yeah, rats.
Coyotes.
Rats. Maybe
Raccoons.
There you go. Also, yeah.
Mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes, big time. And here's the thing. It turns out that very often, the more diverse an area is that's coming into contact with human beings, whether it's through hunting or pets or whatever, each species has its own community of viruses and bacteria and fungi that have become adapted to that organism. And it takes some adaptation, some evolution for them then to be able to jump to humans who are coming into contact. So the greater number of species of animals you're coming in contact, that means the greater chances are that some zoonotic organism is going to be able to jump to human beings because of a coincidental adaptation that makes it possible for it to move. Now remember, these organisms are adapted usually for a fairly narrow range of organisms in which they can survive. Usually one species or a couple of closely related species. And for it to jump from a bird to a human being, that's a major jump because a lot of things have to happen by coincidence for that virus or bacteria or fungus or microorganism to be able to adapt to a new environment of a new genome. That takes a very, very coincidental thing. The greater number of species you have, the greater chance is that's going to happen. Now, of all these organisms, we hear over and over again how important bats are as a major reservoir of the zoonoses, and they are. Right now, the preliminary data indicate that the corona-19 originated in a flying fox, a type of bat in Central Asia, and that it then jumped from the bat to pangolins, and that pangolins are kept as medicinal organisms. Their scales and things are used in Chinese medicine, so they're very commonly kept in these large animal markets in very unsanitary conditions. So this COVID had to jump and had to evolve from being well adapted to this bat to moving to a pangolin, which is very, very unrelated. That must have taken a lot of coincidences. And then it had to evolve again to jump from the pangolin to human beings. Think about all the probabilities of that happening and how few chances there would be. Again, the more animals you have involved, the more species you have involved, the greater the chance, and that's likelihood, that slim likelihood is to happen. So let's look at bats and understand, why do you think bats are so prominent in transfer of viruses to humans? It may be that they're the primary one, they go through a secondary animal like pangolins, but think about this. What do you know about bats that might make them very, very prominent and susceptible to being a source of zoonotics for human beings?
Well, would it be because they eat insects, and when we alter the environment for our homes and stuff, and we have a lot of standing water and mosquitoes, that attracts the insects, and then that attracts the bats?
Okay,
So
that's a possible. Okay, that's a good one. Okay, how about 2 or 3 or 4 more others?
I think they have higher metabolic rates, and they also don't think have higher temperatures to get rid of a lot of their own predators or their own things that might cause disease, and it has something to do with that. And so they actually have and carry more viruses.
Yes, that's great. And you know, in human beings, we have a built-in factor that fights viruses. It's called having a fever. That fever is actually a way for us to fight the virus. And if you have bats that already have a high metabolic rate and high temperature, those viruses or those zoonotics are adapted to high temperatures. And if they get into human beings, they're already pre-adapted for defeating our whole fever protection. Okay, good point. How about another one?
The likelihood of a bat to travel. They have a very large span of travel.
Why aren't you guys in my class? This is great. I got goosebumps. You guys are getting right on this. This is spectacular. Yes.
Dave, Rebecca in the chat said because their immune system is suppressed because they're flying mammals.
Well, their actually immune system is highly developed, and they're hit by so many viruses because they can move around so much. They're going to be exposed to lots and lots of viruses, and those that can't adapt die. And what we get is the leftovers through natural selection. So we get bats that have a super immune system that makes them immune to most of these viruses. So they're not really getting impacts. That's another good one. Excellent. Well, here's some of the ones I have. Their flight and range, as someone mentioned, they can fly long distances. Some of them are migratory between Mexico and the United States. So they cover a lot of area. They're going to be exposed to a lot of other organisms and have a lot of chance to pick up these zoonotic organisms, as well as drop them off in many, many different places. They're also widely distributed and a diverse group. They make up 20% of all the mammal species. And if every species of mammal or every species of bird has got its own community of viruses or zoonotics, If there are 1,400 species of bats, that's a lot of viruses, with each bat having its own community of fairly specialized zoonotics. So they have a large number, mainly because there are so many species. Again, high biodiversity lends itself to high numbers of potential viruses and potential zoonotics. And as someone mentioned, higher metabolic rate and body temperature, so the viruses are pre-adapted to withstand the protection that we have that fevers should give us. And someone else mentioned this one, the innate immunity. They've been exposed so long, there's been natural selection of them to develop extremely good immune systems so that the viruses don't impact them. They can carry them, but not really have the impacts. Bats, for instance, can carry rabies, but show none of the symptoms. They become immune to the rabies virus. And here's another one. Bats also are adapted to have lower temperatures in cooler situations. They can go to what's called torpor, which is overnight hibernation, or they can actually go into hibernation, in which their body temperature is lowered so they aren't using as much energy. And the viruses and zoonotics that they have that are co-evolving with them then become adapted to a wide range of temperatures, from very cool to very warm, which makes them even more likely to be able to adapt quickly to a human being, have a wider scope of temperatures, and it kind of facilitates a spillover to the novel hosts. Okay, good. So, where are the largest pools of potential zoonotics? Where would you think would be the largest pools of zoonotics? Anyone take a guess?
Asia.
Why Egypt? Any other guesses?
The tropics.
Yeah, remember we talked about high biodiversity means lots and lots of potential for zoonotics. The greater the number of species, the greater the number of communities of viruses and bacteria and other zoonotics. So here's a map, and yellow is the lowest number, lowest potential for zoonotic species. Red is a little higher. Purple is the higher. Where is the highest in the whole world? The Amazon. That has, by many experts' opinions, the greatest potential for zoonotics because of the immense potential from so many species of plants and animals and animals that feed on the plants and birds and other things that could then harbor zoonotics, potential zoonotics for us. So now we have the other side of the question. The pandemic is not only affecting the Amazon may be affecting pandemics as well. It's a two-way street that we need to look at and understand as well. So some people say, well, if that's the case, then here's the response. You kill off all the bats, you cut down the forest, and you reduce the chance of having another disastrous worldwide global pandemic. Is that a good way to go? Anybody want to support that one? Do I hear anybody supporting that one? We have an alternative. Even though a lot of people would like to use this as a justification for what's going on right now, we have an alternative. And here's the alternative. We create mechanisms to reward the environmental services. That's the words you're going to be hearing a lot more, are words. Environmental services of standing forest as an alternative basis for the economy in rural Amazonia. What that's saying, in other words, is when you're talking to non-conservationists, when you're talking to business people, when you're talking to people who don't really understand or care about the environment, they only care about business, what's the best way to speak their language? Is that you put economic value on forests as they stand, as Amazon as it stands, on habitats as they stand, and show and indicate to them that these habitats are worth more the way they are intact with their biodiversity than they are cut down. Makes sense, doesn't it? Here's something you got to watch out, and probably most of you are aware of this. Every time we go into these conscious and deliberate decisions to try and make the best decisions, there are inevitably going to be unintended consequences. Inevitably. And to really understand and expect them is almost impossible. But keep that in mind as you go along, looking at this as a solution and understanding there may be some downside to this as well. So Ecosystem services. Again, this is a term you're going to hear more and more and more as more conservation groups are getting into this and understanding this is the way to talk to people who don't appreciate or understand the conservation, who are more interested in profits and business and economics. We don't need to fight with them. We can actually work with them. If we can show them the benefits provided by the ecosystems, contribute to making human life both possible and worth living. So, by some estimates done by conservationists and economists together, an annual investment of $45 billion to biodiversity conservation worldwide could safeguard about $5 trillion in these ecosystem services, a benefit of cost ratio of 100 to 1. And I can guarantee you there's not a stockholder or a stockbroker or a business person or a banker who's not going to take up and notice that is an amazing return, 100 to 1. These ecosystem services include things like pollination, pest and disease management, fresh water, food, habitat and genetic resources, medicines, recreation, erosion prevention, protection from natural disasters, carbon sequestration, storage, air and water pollution control, nutrient cycling, soil fertility. Those are all things that we can put a value on and use that as a way to support this idea of ecosystems monetary value. Are we following that along? Any questions on it?
Yeah, I have a question, Dave.
Okay.
It's a technical question. Where is this diagram from that we're looking at right now? What's the source of that?
I got it off Google. It's a professional, it's a journal article. I can give you the journal article later on.
Yeah, if you'll give me the journal article. I have a collection of articles on ecosystem services as well that I can share in our shared folder. So that'd be terrific. Thank you.
You bet.
Dave,
So
sorry. This is Seth again. I was just wondering, is there a problem though that great return that you showed isn't going to one person or one corporation, or is even identified as being transferred or appearing in someone's bank account, but it's communally shared by everyone? Is that a...
Yeah, there you go. Unintended consequences. And you know a big part of these profits are not going to go to the poor people living in the rural areas. So again, those are unintended consequences that we have to speak to. For instance, talking about shade-grown coffee. That's taken a lot of work because it's more expensive. Yet, if you work together with people down in Costa Rica or wherever, and make sure that they share in the profits that come from that type of situation, it can work out. It takes a lot more work, and it's very easy for it to slip through the exceptions, and that all of a sudden all the rich people are making more money. So again, those are also sociological and economic problems we need to deal with. Good point. Anyway, here's an example that's been used, and it's a really powerful example. Mangrove ecosystems. They provide a multitude of goods and services, mainly on coastal areas, but not only on the coast. They provide what we call provisioning services, fish, crabs, other types of food. They also filter out heavy metals and other types of pollutants to provide clean water. They also have what are called regulating services, and they can influence climate regulation by having more evapotranspiration, forming clouds over these mangroves with more moisture coming off the leaves. They can actually regulate maybe even regional, not just local climate as well. They have supporting services. They maintain the soil so that there's not as much beach erosion. In disaster reduction, they absorb tsunamis, and they absorb the effect of tidal surges from hurricanes, and being very important. And each one of these, you can put a dollar value amount on those. These recreational and ecotourism, maybe spiritual space, giving people a quiet time. That's a little bit harder to put a monetary value on, but again, those are things that can be used as arguments for the value of retaining mangroves and not just cutting them down to make room for new ports and other things, as is often the case. So the natural capital of mangroves has worth in sustaining lives and livelihoods of millions of people along the world's coast in real economic terms, but even affecting people far from the coast, okay? So that makes sense, doesn't it? That makes a lot of sense. One estimate of mangrove and other coastal habitat value done by economists looking at output from coral reefs, seagrass, mangroves, and marine fisheries puts it at $6.9 trillion. Again, that's not chump change. That's a big one, and that's just one group of habitats there in the coastal areas. So if that's the case, let's think about how we can put a dollar value of the Amazon ecosystems and all the different types of services we talked about with the mangrove. What kind of specific dollar value services could you see coming out of the Amazon? Let's think about that and provide. I'm here to learn too, so give me some ideas that we can use to battle the people who want to cut the forest down because they think it's more valuable to put it down as another use. So how can retaining intact rainforest actually be more valuable, give more dollars?
Mike, put in the chat, carbon sinks,
Carbon sink.
climate change.
Go ahead.
Herb put in the chat, fruit, rubber, shade-grown crops, tourism.
Fantastic.
Medicinal plants.
Medicinal, there you go. Okay, and every one of those we can put a dollar value. I might also add, when you're talking to your students, I would encourage you to avoid using the Amazon analogy of it's the lungs of the earth. That really doesn't hold up. Most of our extra oxygen probably comes from plankton in the ocean. And the Amazon probably, the forest there uses almost all the oxygen it produces in photosynthesis in its own respiration. So, but a carbon sink is really important in climate change. Yeah. Any other ideas for anybody?
For me, it's the how it monitors and regulates its own regional weather and climate. And when you take that system away, then it quickly becomes desert, and any agriculture that's dependent on rain from the Amazon can no longer exist in that region.
Yeah, beautiful. Again, just as a review, unlike other forests here in the temperate zones, the Amazon and a lot of tropical forests produce their own rainfall to 75 to 85, maybe more percent of our own rainfall through evapotranspiration. So when you remove the forest, you're actually removing a lot of the rainfall that doesn't come in from the outside. So here are some I thought of, and you've already covered most of these. This is great: ecotourism, Brazil nut farming, rubber tree timber, sequestering carbon dioxide and slowing climate change, regulating the local weather, as you just mentioned, tearing down the forest to reduce rainfall so significantly that would generate, in Brazil alone, a 422 million annual loss to agriculture because you start to dry out the area. And as you get an area drying out, guess what you get? More forest fires, things like that. Okay, now we've talked about what's going on here, and this is seems to be a good approach to be able to argue with politicians and try and get them to change their mind on the value of standing intact rainforest in the Amazon. Let me show you some of the unintended consequences. Seth mentioned one of them, but here are some even more, and they're well-meaning, really well-meaning, but they turn very, very quickly. We call it ecological triage. Once you start to value organisms and habitats, automatically some are going to be more valuable than others. The Galapagos tortoise and the oryx do not have anywhere the amount of value of the dung beetle. The dung beetle's got much more value. Does that mean then that species that are unprofitable, we aren't going to protect them? We're not going to. We can't afford to protect everything, so we all of a sudden start to have a priority. And our priorities are those organisms that have the greatest value. We've walked right into this, trying to put value on things, and now we're finding the next thing that comes up is ecological triage. And you say, oh no, that'll never happen. We'll protect everything. But look what happened. And I can talk about this. I actually had a guinea worm I got in India. It's the longest nematode in the world. It's a meter-long nematode. It gets under your skin. And Jimmy Carter and Bill Gates decided they wanted to eradicate. They consciously chose to exterminate a species. Now think about the ethical aspects of that. Does anybody there think that they were wrong? And they have virtually through water filters, have virtually eradicated the guinea worm. It's only a few places left now in southern Sudan. Is that appropriate? Does anybody have an idea, anything against it? Would it be inappropriate to spend $87.5 million to eradicate a parasite like this and successfully? Any objections? It seems straightforward to me, but think about the slippery slope. We're on a slippery slope. We have ethically decided we can choose to eliminate a species. So why does that mean we can carry it one step farther? Other species are considered economic pests. If you're a rancher in Montana or Wyoming, you do not want those wolves coming in from Yellowstone. They're going to kill your cows and calves. They do. Why do we have any wolves allowed to come out of Yellowstone? Why do we even have them there in the first place? They're causing great economic damage. If you live in Tanzania or Kenya and you're a farmer growing crops, a herd of elephants, and this is happening more and more often as the national parks get smaller and the corridors get smaller, they're moving into farmland, and in one night they can completely wipe out a farmer's crop for the whole year. One night. What's the economic benefit there? They're costing people their livelihood. This is a friend of mine, Jake the snake, is a Mojave rattlesnake. I just ran into him last week on one of my study sites. And for most snake bites here in Arizona, a diamondback, for instance, is not as venomous as a Mojave, but you still have to get at least one anti-venom shot. Each shot costs $4,000. That doesn't include doctor's bills, hospital bills. With a Mojave rattle, because it has neurotoxin, you need at least 4 or 5 shots. We're talking about $20,000 to $25,000 for your shots. Now, insurance may or may not cover that, but why in the world, if we're starting to value things, does a rattlesnake have any value at all when it's just the opposite? If you go to East Africa again, and you have a crop of small seed barley or oats or wheat, and all of a sudden 11 to 12 million qualia descend on your crop. This bird, that's a flock of birds. And in 1 week, they completely wipe out your crop. What is the economic benefit? There is no economic benefit to the qualia. Let's exterminate it. If we can do it for guinea worms, why can't we do it for any of these other organisms as well? There is the slippery slope. Where is the ethics? Where do we stop? How do we know which ones of these species are appropriate or inappropriate? That's a really hard question, not an easy one.
Dave, an Amazon example would be leafcutter ants.
There you go, leafcutter ants, yep. How about mosquitoes? How about there's mosquitoes? Why not wipe out all the mosquitoes? Is that inappropriate? Again, leafcutter ants, mosquitoes, other types of insects, bushmasters, again, different types of snakes. Those are other examples, okay? And then we've got this other possibility too. If you're doing evaluations based on economic returns, you may say, well, yeah, the forest is worth a lot, but ranching and mining in the Amazon are also worth a lot. And on the short term, more than the long term. And it also affects you directly, how much you pay for beef and especially soybeans. Those are the 2 main reasons that farmers and agribusiness are clearing the Amazon, for cattle and for growing soybeans. And look at the bottom picture. That's Madre de Dios in southeastern Peru, near Puerto Maldonado. That's happened in the last 3 years, in which we've seen square mile after square mile of forest not only being logged, but for gold mining using heavy metals like mercury, in which the soil is contaminated so that forest will not return, not in years, but for decades and decades, if it's ever returned. And those gold mines are considered very, very valuable. Again, once you open up the door of valuating different types of ecosystems, these are the trade-offs you're going to have to learn to accept and understand.
Hey, Dave, we have a question in the chat from Melissa. Her question is, who determines what's ethical or not?
There you go. I love that question. Did Bill Gates and Jimmy Carter automatically determine that the guinea worm ethically could be wiped out? And if so, maybe so, it's ethically okay to wipe out something that's totally harmful. But if it opens up the door for other things that are not quite as clear cut, does the ethics then go out the door? I don't know. Does anybody have a suggestion? Who should make these? Should we have a governing board of ethics? Is that going to be possible? How should the ethical questions be answered? Anybody have a suggestion?
In the chat, stakeholders, but then the question becomes, how do you determine who the stakeholders are?
Yeah, and what is stakeholders' interest? Some of them may very much be interested in economics, and a gold mine is going to return more to them in the short term than a forest. Those are problems, and I don't have any easy answer for that one. But think about that. That'd be a great thing to discuss with your students too. I find students are really into the nuance and discovering the nuances of ethics. They come into the class thinking it's kind of all black and white, and a discussion like this can really affect them for the rest of their lives, understanding you've got to be very nuanced in understanding ethics. It's not all black and white.
Carly posted in the comments, and this is a good point. A committee of the United Nations could make recommendations, and so the biodiversity goals and the sustainability goals, Ava could maybe speak to that a little bit too, because she's done a deep dive into those. I'm sure that there's some influencing language in there as well.
That's fine, although the United Nations has made some decisions that I don't agree with at all. Again, who do you trust? How do you work? Who's going to be on that committee? Are all parts of the complex problem. But yes, that might well be a place to start. So let's look at now the impact directly. We've looked at some of the effects of the Amazon on pandemics. Now let's look more in detail at the pandemic effect, especially the COVID-19 pandemic effect on the Amazon. We have a person in Brazil. His name is Jair Bolsonaro. Everybody heard of Jair Bolsonaro? He's the president of Brazil. Very conservative. He's involved with economics more than anything else. And he has both directly and indirectly encouraged more logging in the forest. And since April this year, Brazilian deforestation has increased by 64% in the same month in 2019. And we can look at that and see that from satellites. A big part of that is a political decision that he felt that he's able to do in the middle of this pandemic by saying, listen, we have to provide jobs. Our economy is suffering. We have to move forward wherever we can go. Also, he's working on this. The expected recession is going to follow this pandemic will inspire further deforestation through the same argument. We need to bolster the economy. The environment is fine, but when it means that people are losing their jobs, and I want you each to think about, and you've probably done this before, think about some poor campesino in the middle of Pará state in Brazil who maybe earns $10 a month. Are we to say to him, oh no, you cannot go in there and take any logs out and earn $100 because we want this to be a national park? Those are the types of arguments that are being used, and they can be very, very effective against conservation. And here's another big part of what's happening is the police and all the environmental protection are at home. They're protecting themselves. They're no longer out there protecting. And deforestation and logging has just become not only encouraged by the president, but more possible because even the few laws that were available are now no longer being enforced. And here's what we mentioned before, another connection. Because of the increased amount of logged forest, there is less rainfall. Those forests produce their own rainfall. That means the surrounding forest adjacent to what has been deforested is becoming drier and will also produce more fires the next season. Which brings us to this. Think about now what would you consider are some of the impacts on the indigenous people? Give me some ideas of what you consider the most important critical impacts of this factor of the increased deforestation by the COVID pandemic on the indigenous people living in the Amazon.
Offer up some of the chat. Go for it, whoever just logged on. Access to resources is what Melissa said. Increased climate change, complete disregard over short-term economic gain, cultural loss, specifically to the indigenous peoples. For those of you that sat in on last month's webinar with Liz Benson, she addressed some of these things as well as far as what was happening with the Mayahuna indigenous group that we partner with. Anybody want to bring up any of her points that she brought to the fore?
Weren't they increasingly isolated and very difficult to get the very few needed things from outside?
Yep, another point, yep.
Yeah, very much so.
Also
Well,
going in the other direction, how precarious their lives are in terms of being able to get even their goods out to market, out to Masan and to other places. So it went in both directions.
The other big piece of this is, as you well know, for those of you that have interacted with the Mayahuna, there's less than 500 identified Mayahuna, and so COVID could think about our beloved friends Sebastian and Victorino and the workshop leaders that we work with. All of that knowledge, they're the last of the community to carry first person remembrance of traditional ecological knowledge and ancestral lands, language. If you lose people like Victorino and Nancy and Sebastian, the language is basically dead because there's nobody to carry it on.
Good point. So you covered most of the things. Here's the ones I had. What we're finding is more and more colonial expropriation by landless immigrants and agribusiness. They're taking advantage of the legalities and moving right in. We did the same thing here in the United States with our indigenous groups. Exactly the same thing, where you use the colonists as a way to expand the influence, and agribusiness follows right behind. And again, think about this. Can you talk to some poor campesino in Brazil or Peru who has no money and tell him, no, he can't go in there? What's going on when there are no laws, no police? It's a difficult situation. And someone mentioned this too, all of a sudden, many of these indigenous groups have actually become more and more dependent on outside sources of food. They don't do all of their own hunting. All of their food doesn't come from, as it used to maybe 50, 60, 80 years ago. They need outside import of some of the supplies. Another one, education or training to anticipate or oppose illegal land grabs. They don't have that. There may be some advocacy groups that would be willing to help them, but they're not coming down now. I can guarantee you there's no advocacy groups that are going to help them, at least in person, on their lands right now. And this is exactly when they need those kinds of help, when people are trying to grab their land illegally. Also, this happens it's happening in Brazil. You think it'd be incredible, but harsh employment and indentured services lead to more cultural losses. And it's almost like slavery. It's happening right now. And as someone mentioned before, cultural and physical genocide. Those are all some of the impacts. And these were going on before COVID-19, but they've only increased because of the lack of these protections that some of the advocacy groups and police and conservation groups were providing and have had to pull out. Impact of climate change. Look at this as well. There's some obvious ones. We've talked about that. Change in rainfall patterns, intense drought, dry riverbeds, which means that fishing and the other things getting out of the rivers are no longer available. More forest fires, less rainfall, more forest fires, and it just expands in a never-ending vicious cycle. Less food available, more carbon dioxide release. That's the big one for us. That's no longer is this forest storing our carbon dioxide, so it's not leading to more climate change, more warming, but now it's being released and doing just the opposite, increasing the warming and changing climate even faster. And here's one, it brings us full cycle back. As more people become in contact with more biodiversity, because these loggers, these colonists are also hunting. They're also out there face to face, being exposed to more mosquitoes. They're getting closer to bats. They're contacting more of the biodiversity by being right in the forest. And these zoonoses then have every possibility of jumping, evolving, and being able to jump to human beings. And then once they get to any human beings in the world, we know how easy it is for them to spread from even isolated parts of the world. My last aspect, my last part of this is, again, other impacts of the Amazon on us and how this pandemic is affecting us. We want cheap things. We talked about cattle and we talked about soybeans. Those are very, very common parts of our food and our environment, and how we choose to use them, buy them, along with pineapples and black pepper and other things that can only be grown in destroyed forest. What we consume affects what they're going to go after. If all of a sudden we stop buying and using soybeans, or we stop buying and using beef, there would be no market, and there would be no way and no profit for them to continue to cut down the forest to have more cattle farms and grow more soybeans. That's kind of an extreme situation. But again, we are not immune from what's going on in the Amazon. How we buy, what we consume, what we demand affects them, and now even more so with the coronavirus pandemic. I have my hopes. We talked about this too, how something as global and as profound as a pandemic, can it change people? Will it change adults? Will it change the kids in our classes forever? Will they forever remember what happened during these 3 or 4 years, which they had to go through a very different situation? Will it change them for the better? Will it improve their attitudes and no longer make them lackadaisical about what's going on in the environment when they see what could happen? Will people in New Delhi, who have seen in a few days how much the air can be cleaned up if the automobiles are not moving back and forth on the streets, will that be just a temporary change, or will it have a lasting impact to tell them, listen, we saw what happened, we can do something about it. We know for sure that by affecting pollution from automobiles, we can change the environment very, very quickly. We've seen it happen right in front of us. Let's do something about it. Are those all positive things? Will consumers change deep-seated shopping habits and become more sensitive to the impact of their choices on what they buy? I sure hope so. And I have a faith and a hope in humanity. There are enough people out there that this is going to impact them, and that there'll be positive outcomes to this as well. One last thing is, and I'd like to talk about this, is something that's not as obvious as cultural sensitivity. You've heard the term Chinese virus, a bit racist to say the least, but can we find more cultural sensitivity? Will people react to these types of things in a positive way, say, wait a minute, we have to work together. This global pandemic affected us all. Do we have to work together? I have one example I use all the time. Will someone there define natural for me?
All right.
Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
From the chat, made by nature, not man-made, occurs in nature.
Okay, here is the definition we often rely on. Existing in or caused by nature, not made or caused by humankind. And it is a definition that is related to our Judeo-Christian culture, nothing more. It is not in the rest of the world. And it affects us extremely. It makes it very difficult for us in this culture to be able to reach out and become part of nature. We see ourselves as apart from nature. We see ourselves as controlling nature. And what we find is when I go to Thailand, or I'm with my friends in the Mahuna or the Kofans or the Quichuas, they have no problem seeing human beings as one species in a community of species. We're part of nature, not a part of nature. That sounds kind of subtle, but it's extremely important. Homo sapiens is a member of the species community in every habitat, and we can see that especially with this Corona-19 pandemic. We are directly related to the pangolins, to the bats, not only them, but to cattle and pigs. Those are all species that affect us directly. We cannot see ourselves as something special. And if we don't understand that, we are going to have a very hard time having the sophistication to find the cures and ways to overcome these pandemics in the future. Those are some of the problems with the old definition of natural. And I'd like to challenge all of you to change your mind on how you define nature. Never again define nature as not being man-made. Natural has to include us. I'll stop preaching there. Anyway, here's the last thing, balanced biodiversity. This is a way of approaching and bringing all these things together. Every conservation investment is a statement of priorities. I don't know how you can get around that. Funding organization or government investing in areas it considers to be high priority. That's going to be part of our plans for conservation and environment, including this as a big part of where we go, how we decide. Balanced biodiversity can protect human health by reducing the risk of acquiring infectious diseases. If we do it correctly, thriving biodiversity can reduce the encounter rates between pathogens and humans and prevent the next pandemic. That is a big argument, a very important argument for economics, for health, for worldwide impact. Use this. If we have a balanced biodiversity and we don't permit those viruses from the bats to get to the pangolins to get to us, if we put barriers in the way by creating natural areas that are not having as much contact with human beings, we may prevent the next pandemic. And the economic benefits of no pandemic are staggering and perhaps a broad argument against deforestation in the Amazon that even politicians and business people can embrace. I hope we've got some idea of how complex this is and also some better ideas of where to look for solutions. And I would love to hear what kinds of ideas you come up with your students. I'd love to hear what some of these students are, how they're responding to this. They often come up to ideas that I would never have thought of, and I hope that you can share with some of these in the future. Anyway, mucho gusto de verte otra vez y hablar con ustedes y ojalá la próxima vez vamos a estar en Perú juntos. Ya vamos. Ciao.
And that's it for tonight, everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you'd like to see upcoming webinars, you can find the registration information at morphoinstitute.org/webinars, and you can also access recordings of previous webinars and the curriculum resources that we're putting together to support those. Thanks so much again for joining us, and we'll see you next month.